This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
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 So we're having a discussion about what's going on in Canada in relation to COVID-19. I'm about to play a video for you guys. It was put up by Toronto Sun. Lockdown protests, people gather at Queen's Park against COVID-19 restrictions. 211 thumbs up, 86 thumbs down. Just before we play it, I'm just going to go through the top comments here and let you guys know kind of what the Canadian opinion related to this is. We start off with Sean Doyle, 45 thumbs up, saying that the reporter is a joke. Let's just take a quick look at the replies. Sadly, Warmington has become a mere shadow of his original classy self. I do sense some misgivings on his part about having to report on this at all. Did anyone notice he did a lot of talking out of both sides of his mouth on this one? Maybe he's not illegal election day campaigning by Incubit in South York Weston on election day 2019. He played dumb, wouldn't even go check the election laws. Now, next comment. Only the elderly and sickly should be in quarantine voluntarily. 1. The ventilators have been killing people, 80% death rate. When given oxygen instead, they recover. When given hydroxychloroquine, they recover. When given high amounts of vitamin C, A, D, and iodine and zinc, they recover. Masks cannot keep out a virus unless it's airtight. 500 million viruses can sit on the head of a pin. They did not work at all in China where everyone was wearing them. It's simply a visual to increase fear. Epidemics always go on a bell curve. The quicker they rise, the quicker they fall. Sooner or later, it needs to circulate through the population in order to weaken and disappear. Stretching out the bell curve through quarantine results in more deaths in the long run, which any well-informed epidemiologist knows. The excuse for ignoring this fact was there would not be enough ventilators, which brings me back to point number 1. Next comment. Lying reporter. The virus is not and never was raging. Stop lying. There will be more businesses gone belly up than deaths caused by COVID-19.
Ontario right now is closed, and these people want it open. The problem is that the coronavirus is still raging through much of the province. We see that every day. There's new cases every day, and people are dying every day. But the weather's getting better. Businesses are worried about what's going to happen in the future. And this protest came here to Queen's Park to try to implore the message that at some point they have to reopen. Protesters like this young man from Coburg who's lost his job.
I'm just here as an unemployed single father who is also an animal advocate, who just wants to see our public spaces open back up, who wants to see small businesses be able to operate with controlled measures. There's a lot of small communities that have a lot of businesses that are not operating right now. They don't have Walmart. They don't have Metro.
The protesters were very loud about how they went about their business here today. They're calling out Premier Doug Ford. But the Premier also called them out. In fact, going as far as to say some of them were yahoos, and even suggesting that they don't care about the rest of Ontario. Clearly they were violating the bylaws here today. Didn't see any tickets handed out, but there could have been, like there has been in the parks. We'll see what happens as we go forward, but a lot of people are getting frustrated. But it must be noted that there was less than 200 people at this protest. So the majority seem to still be going along with what the government's asking them to do. With Ernest DeRosa at Queen's Park, Joe Warmington for the Toronto Sun.
All right, so just for context, I'm someone who opposes the lockdowns that are occurring right now. And not for 1 second, and I guess this is for Ford, not for 1 second does that mean that I don't care about my fellow Canadians. But I do have questions that aren't being answered, and I don't understand why it is that I'm not the only Canadian. There's tons of us that have questions that aren't being answered by the government in relation to actually what's going on here. It doesn't matter if you're on the conservative or on the liberal side of things. There's absolutely questions that haven't been answered. We're curious what's going on with China. We're curious what's going on with the World Health Organization. I'm curious about Deborah Birx specifically stating, just one sec here, Deborah Birx specifically stating that the World Health Organization overinflated numbers for COVID. So, I mean, this is someone that I've been told that I'm supposed to be trusting, but she specifically is the one coming out saying that, well, let's just take a look. Burke says government is classifying all deaths of patients with coronavirus as COVID-19 deaths, regardless of cause. And the reason why that's concerning is because this is coming from the World Health Organization and the CDC. 25% overinflated numbers for COVID. Dr. Birx reportedly believes death toll inflated by up to 25%. Dr. Deborah Birx, the White House Coronavirus Task Force Response Coordinator, believes some official COVID-19 statistics like death tolls may be inflated by up to 25%, a new report states. Birx criticized the method the Center of Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, was using to collect its data during a heated task force meeting. There is nothing from the CDC I can trust, Birx reportedly told CDC Director Robert Redfield. Birx said the Post in a statement that mortality is slowly declining each day and that the focus should be on protecting Americans who are older or have pre-existing health conditions that make them vulnerable to the virus. To keep with this trend, it is essential that seniors and those with comorbidities shelter in place and that we continue to protect vulnerable communities. The concern, the problem I have with that is that if we're overinflated by 25% based on direct instruction from the CDC on how these numbers should be put through, then what that would state is that that confirms 74,532 is overinflated by roughly 25%. And the reason why that scares me is because that would remove 18,633, bringing us to 55,899 confirmed cases, which would put us in a spot where we were slightly sitting over the flu. We were slightly sitting over influenza. I'm on canada.ca, public health information. On average, 99.6% of labs reported during the 2018-19 season, a total of 48,818 influenza detections were reported. So this is comparable to the flu. According to the numbers that we have now, that this has managed to ravage the world, this is comparable to the flu. But the Yukon was unlocked. We locked down the Yukon. 2 cases, we locked down the Yukon. Now, the reason why I played the video from the Toronto Sun that I played for you guys is because of the way that they talked about the protest occurring. They had to make sure at the end of the video that they reminded you that it was only 200 people, that most people get it, that there's a very, very minute group of people who are opposed to what's going on right now. But I don't think that that's true. Small group protest coronavirus restrictions in Vancouver, no charges laid following fish harvest protest Saturday. So this is in Newfoundland case. So the government of Newfoundland, by the way, lost it with the people for protesting because they had 32 new cases, bringing them up to 67. I would like to know how many cases of the flu you have in Newfoundland right now. I'm not trying to mitigate what's going on, and I'm not trying to say that this isn't real. I absolutely believe that coronavirus or COVID-19 is a real thing, but I don't believe that the way that we're responding economically to what's happening here is going to do anything except for wipe out the country. We don't have, and no one's explained to us how we intend to come back from this. We have people telling the governor that we could be, we have people telling the Prime Minister, Justin, that we could be $1 trillion in debt, $1 trillion in debt, risk of being $1 trillion in debt over Corona, Trudeau. But I don't know if you guys remember this, but Trudeau's budget, so boom, right there, SpencerFernando.com 2018, it never balanced itself. Trudeau never balanced the budget. Trudeau never put us in a situation where we would ever be trusting in relation to him or his entire government on how they spend our money. This was a big deal, if you guys all remember. It was a big deal that Justin Trudeau, and it wasn't just Trudeau. If you guys are living in Ontario, you remember Kathleen Wynne. Do you guys remember that she literally banked, Ford came in and he told us about the fact that the province, Ford, you guys remember, he got nuked for this, said the province is bankrupt. Why did he say that? Because of Kathleen Wynne and the spending practices of the Liberals while they were in power. They wiped out the province. They absolutely wiped out the province financially. And this was a big deal. All of this was a big deal before Corona came through. The fact that we don't actually know what the plan is because we're in serious dire straits. And now Justin Trudeau is handing out all of the money that exists for future generations to deal with this. And I, as a Canadian who's not working right now, I'm getting nervous. Hundreds flocked to Alberta legislature to protest COVID-19 restrictions. Protests continue at Alberta's Cargill meat processor. Police sheriffs to monitor end of lockdown protest at Alberta legislature. Vancouver protests call coronavirus fake news and say distancing rules should be defied, appalling health authorities. British Columbians can now face a $25,000 fine, jail. So 25 grand or jail. So you could be fined more than you make a year on minimum wage if you ignore public health orders over COVID-19. These are the law. Yukoners can now be jailed for ignoring COVID-19 orders. Yukon declares state of emergency over COVID-19. Declaration should not cause panic, officials say, and risk level in Yukon remains unchanged. Northwest Territories are releasing some prisoners over COVID-19 concerns in jails. Why? Why would you be concerned that prisoners in the Northwest Territories, I don't actually understand. You would be in some of the most isolated jails that you could possibly be in the Northwest Territories. And we are releasing prisoners and sending them out into the world because they could be running the risk of coronavirus in prison. We're not done here. RPS deals with protests at legislative building opposing COVID restrictions. Hundreds protest COVID-19 social restrictions at Alberta legislature grounds. Families protest Quebec's ban on visitors to long-term care homes fearing neglect. The utmost disrespect, Doug Ford slams second, not the first one, second Toronto protest against coronavirus restrictions. Protesters demand end to Manitoba's COVID-19 lockdown measures. Protesters ignore social distancing, call for end to restrictions. This is in Winnipeg. What's going on right now? What's actually going on right now? I can tell you exactly what's going on right now. If Justin Trudeau hadn't given $600 million given by Trudeau government to news, if Trudeau had not given and paid off the news to the tune of $600 million before getting reelected, it would be a different story. You guys would see the truth. You guys would see the truth. But you guys don't see the truth because the Liberals pledged to roll out nearly $600 million in subsidies to select news media outlets is one of the most controversial spending plans on the government's 2019 budget. Why is it controversial? The reason why it's controversial is because as Canadians, most of us believe that we should have the right to determine which news sources we want to watch. We have the right to determine which information we want to believe to be valid. You can be wrong, but that's the thing. You have the right to be wrong. You have the right to be. You have the right to go and read the information. You have the right to choose which channel you want to turn on. You have the right to choose which reporter you want to listen to get your daily fix of the news. You as a Canadian have every right to do that. No, you don't. You don't. Because Justin Trudeau made the decision to give $600 million in subsidies to select news media outlets. The fact that the government was directly paying off the media to make sure that they weren't speaking poorly about them. Why wouldn't this bother people? The federal government is stepping in to help struggling Canadian media industry with new tax credits and incentives, valued at nearly $600 million over the next 5 years. To protect the vital role that independent news media play in our democracy and in our communities, we will be introducing measures to help support journalism in Canada. How is it an independent news media when you pay for it? How is it an independent news media when it's paid for by one political side of the aisle? How is that independent in any shape, way, or form? How would it be independent for you guys to go out there and make the decision that you're going to pay these guys but not pay those guys because you prefer, as the one making the decision on how the money's spent, you prefer. That preferential treatment creates a situation where you can't use the word independent anymore. You can't call it independent because it's not independent, because you paid for it. Therefore, it's dependent on you to exist. Because if it was independent, you would not need to spend money on it because, wait a second, it's independent. This is wild. It's really wild when we start to really dig into why it is that we're not getting all the information that we need. Because we do need this information. We do need to know what's going on across Canada. We do need to know how people feel about it. Do you notice how the gun ban, it was this quick blip and it's off the news? Just one second here. Let's get an update on what's going on with Justin Trudeau's gun ban. Oh, look, National Post first link. Let's just look at this because we reported this the other day, but we're going to talk about it. Trudeau's gun ban appeared to prohibit some coffee, a website, and a toy. Here's why. I can't wait for this. One firearm, just one sec, banned by the Liberal government is a highly obscure AR rifle built by Blackwater, a U.S. private military company that featured heavily in the Iraq War. Okay, that's the airsoft rifle. Ottawa. When the Liberal government banned 1,500 firearms earlier this month, there was one in particular on the prohibition list that raised eyebrows. The Blackwater BW-15, a product widely used as a battery-powered airsoft gun that fires plastic pellets. Chat forums, gun blogs, and some corners of social media went ablaze on the news. Had Justin Trudeau really outlawed an airsoft gun? Gun retailers contacted by the National Post were perplexed, saying the confusion heaped new uncertainty onto the sweeping ban that was already set to cost the industry hundreds of millions in unsellable inventory. Would Canadians actually be forced to surrender their plastic toys? So it's not just plastic toys. What is Justin Trudeau banning? So do you guys know if you go onto that list, you can find 120 millimeter mortars? You can find like surface to air missiles. You can find anti-tank rifles. The list is insane. Like the list is absolute. There are weapons there that you guys have never been able to access at any point in time in Canada. There are tear gas cannons on there, like antiquated, what's it called, Lake Erie systems. It's an antiquated tear gas cannon. Like we went through this list previously, and it looks like whoever wrote the list has at no point in time ever handled a firearm or had any kind of an educational lesson on firearms. Do you know AR15.com is banned? AR15.com as in the website, and it wasn't banned once, it was duplicate, so it was redundantly banned on Trudeau's 1,500 list. He's going after 10 and 12 gauge shotguns. That he's going after handguns, and he's bypassing Parliament to do that by pushing it to the municipalities. That this entire 1,500 gun ban was bypassing Parliament, because instead of putting it through so that it could be voted on, so that the people could determine how they felt about it, Justin Trudeau used, just one second. Last weekend I said there was one word, useless, to describe the ban on what federal liberals like to call assault rifles. Let me add another, chaotic. Banning legal gun owners from possessing certain models of firearms would not have prevented any of the mass killings in recent Canadian history. École Polytechnique, the Quebec City Mosque, or last month in Nova Scotia. That makes the ban useless. And this is, we already know this. It's not, no one's denying this part. For example, in Nova Scotia, not only did he not just use firearms, he used arson to murder people, but the firearms that he had were illegal. The only firearm that he had that was not illegally obtained was the one he took from an RCMP officer, which by definition, the second he took off of an RCMP officer's person was de facto illegal. So every firearm that he had was not allowed to be had. There's nothing inside of the ban that would have prevented this from actually occurring. This is really important because we are now banning weapons across the country to try to prevent something, and the solution has absolutely nothing to do with what's occurred. Nor will the ban announced by Trudeau government prevent bank heists or drug gang turf wars, because the ban only impacts legit owners, and legit owners are not the source of crime. But the ban is worse than useless. It's almost impossible to comprehend. While the government decreed via order in council rather than act of parliament, order in council. So what does this mean? Instead of using an act of parliament, so instead of putting it through the proper legal process to allow the people of Canada to be the final determining factor on whether or not the law was going to be changed, we used an order in council, which means that Justin Trudeau can bypass Parliament. Why would he ever do that? Because Justin Trudeau is the lord of not answering questions. It's a lot easier to put something like this through, which you never would have gotten through, by just avoiding Parliament. The problem with that is that Canada is a Western nation, and it has, well, I mean, we had laws. So let's just take a look here. Commentary. Data shows Toronto's gun surge never happened. What? Earlier this summer, a summer that has seen Toronto racked by gun violence, a report came out that suggested lawful Canadian gun owners were to blame for at least some of the violence. The article was originally published by the Canadian Press and widely republished elsewhere, including at the CBC, the National Post, a dozen local newspapers, CTV News, and yes, here at Global News. Since then, it has been widely cited in other news stories covering the issue, including the Toronto Star, the Globe and Mail. The report was everywhere. Here's the problem. Newly released stats show clearly that it was wrong. The article was based around an interview with a Toronto Police Services detective, Rob D. Dinelli. Detective D. Dinelli told the Canadian Press that Canadians who were lawfully licensed to purchase and possess firearms were increasingly a public safety issue. They go get their license for the purpose of becoming a firearms trafficker, D. Dinelli told the CP. A lot of people are so ready to blame the big bad Americans, but we had our own little problem here. The CP article hangs on this revelation from the detective. It notes in various places the number of guns obtained illegally in Canada but are then sold to people who use them for criminal purposes has surged dramatically in recent years compared to firearms smuggled from the United States, Toronto police say. And in recent years, investigators say they have noticed a stark shift in where guns used to commit crimes are coming from. And legal Canadian gun owners are selling their weapons illegally, D. Dinelli said, noting that police have seen more than 40 such cases in recent years. So, what's going on right now is I'm listening to this, and what it's telling me is that every news organization that we would normally listen to, CBC, National Post, CTV, Global News, Toronto Star, Globe and Mail, everybody, Everyone is giving us a report directly from Toronto Police Services Detective Rob D. Danelli. So why would we not just assume this to be absolutely true, right? And why is this important? Because did we not base a handgun, we're attempting to put through a handgun ban based on the information provided, based on the horrific situation inside of Toronto. So is it important whether or not the information and the veracity of the information being provided to you guys is true? So let's keep digging. The article absolutely informed the debate unfolding in Canada and specifically in Toronto right now. I can speak to that directly. While discussing the issues of handguns in Canada these last few weeks on the radio program, online, and in columns, the article has been repeatedly sent to me as a form of rebuttal. See, Gurney, see, lawful Canadian gun owners are the problem. Read the article and weep. But the article doesn't cite any statistics to back up its main assertion that criminals in Toronto are being provided firearms by licensed owners and increasing surging numbers. So, according to the documents being provided, so the article that was put out that everyone was basing the fact that it was legal gun owners causing the issue in Toronto, according to the original article that was posted, there are no statistics to back up the main assertion. So the main point of the article has no verifiable information to lean back on. At the time the CP story first ran, there was no publicly available stats to support or contradict what D. Danelli had told them. But now, those numbers are publicly available. Thanks to Dennis R. Young, an Alberta-based researcher who filed a Freedom of Information request with the Toronto Police, published their reply on his websites. And these stats tell a very different story. So wait. So what we're saying right now is that the news and the Toronto Police Services came out and provided information by D. Danelli. So it's not, I'm not saying the whole Toronto Police Services, but this guy, D. Danelli, from the Toronto Police Services came out to the news, provided information on the fact that we needed to deal with this because people were dying, because people are losing their lives as a result of the astronomically high crime. And the entire crux of the issue is that legal firearm holders in Canada are going off and buying guns and then selling them to criminals. That's what we were told by the Toronto Police, by the news. That's what we were told. And then what happened? Wait a second. So Dennis R. Young, all he had to do was file a Freedom of Information request with the Toronto Police, and then he got the actual information, like real data. So it was there. It was there. Wait a sec. Because if he filed a Freedom of Information request to get the information, then it was sent to him. What that means is that that information was available at the time. That information was available at the time. Was D. Danelli lying to the news, ergo lying to Canadians, ergo causing policy change based on a lie? Let's keep reading. In short, there is no surge in crime guns that can be traced back to licensed Canadian gun owners. None. It's just not there. The Toronto Police Service's own statistics show no such surge. For instance, see this chart below, it tracks the number of gun crimes that can be sourced either to Canada or the United States. The CP article asserts that there's been a surge of Canadian-sourced guns since 2012, but these numbers go back as far as 2007. Look for yourself, where's the surge? Where's the surge? There's no surge in guns traced back to Canada. There's an ebb and flow across the years, but no surge post-2012. In fact, if you look carefully, you'll see that while the number of guns sourced from Canada bounces up and down a bit, the overall trend is down. But let's be even more specific. The Toronto Police definition of a domestically sourced crime gun is broader than the definition of a crime gun that's specifically traced back to a lawfully licensed gun owner. That makes perfect sense. Let's figure out what that means. The people discussed in the CP article, but the number of guns traced directly back to licensed individuals is also available in the Toronto Police stats. Please see below for that comparison. Crime guns traced back to the United States versus traced back directly back to lawful Canadian owners. That's lawful Canadian owners. Once again, You'll see some variation year by year, but the number of Toronto crime guns traced back directly back to licensed Canadian owners is much fewer than those traced back to the United States. It is also trending down over time. There is no surge post-2012. The number actually dropped sharply in 2013 and then returned to a more typical level, which is still well down from 10 years ago. In fact, each of the last 5 years would rank in the lowest 5 years in Toronto police tracing guns back to lawfully licensed Canadians. All of them are below the 2012 figure, which itself was below 2011's. Indeed, even if we have the more expansive definition of domestically sourced, every single year post-2012 shows fewer crime guns seized in Toronto than in 2012 itself. Surge? What surge? There are broader issues here as well. The vast majority of guns are never traced back to any particular origin. Take 2017, for instance. Of the more than 1,700 firearms seized by Toronto police that year, only 330 guns could be linked to either Canada or the United States. It's even more stark in other years, as the chart shows below. Total firearms seized, Canada and the United States. The legal, so the whole crux, the legal firearm holders that are going to have their rights, basically taken away from them in relation to their ability to, we'll go hunting. So total number of firearms seized overall versus crime guns seized from Canada and the United States. This is total firearms. There's the United States. There's Canada. See those lines smooshed way down at the bottom? Those are the guns that are actually traced to Canada or the United States. We're arguing over rounding errors, but even so, you'll know no radical shifts, no surges anywhere, let alone after 2012. And there's another revealing insight in the numbers released by the Toronto Police. Roughly half of the crime guns seized by Toronto Police in 2017 were classified under Canadian law as prohibited, meaning they are virtually banned and only rarely possessed by any Canadian civilian. The only real exceptions are Canadians who own said firearms before the current gun control classification system was introduced in the 1990s. Any kind of further crackdown on gun ownership in Canada would have extraordinarily limited impact on these guns, which, again, were half of the crime guns seized in Toronto in 2017. I haven't crunched the numbers for each year going back to 2007, but prohibited guns are a major portion of the total in every year. The guns are effectively banned already. Is that not evidence that the debate about banning guns is missing the mark? The guns were already banned. The guns that are in Toronto committing the crimes that aren't coming from Canada, that are already banned, that can already not legally be sold in Canada, that are causing the problem, are not going to be affected by you guys putting another ban out on legal firearm holders within the country that have not committed crimes. This is not the right solution, and everyone knows. Everyone who's taken just a couple of minutes to look into this, it doesn't matter which side of the aisle you're on, it doesn't matter if you're pro or anti-gun, anyone who looks at this from a logical perspective can tell that the solution being provided to Canadians right now is not appropriate. It does not solve the global issues that you guys are telling us you're trying to solve. It does not keep us safer. It in fact creates a more dangerous situation for us. Look at Australia if you want to see a perfect test model for what happens when you disarm the entire population, with the exception of disarming those who are illegally possessing firearms. Because Australia is a fantastic example. The UK is a fantastic example. There's multiple countries that have already done this, and we know what happens when you do this. The people who are already committing crimes are not deterred by more laws being put into place that they will be in violation of while they break the law, because that's illogical. But the people who are legally possessing firearms, who have not committed a crime, who have not been irresponsible, who are daily checked by the RCMP to confirm that they are within compliance of the law, they will suffer under this. They will suffer because of this. And I am nervous that this is all occurring at the same time. I am nervous that in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, Justin Trudeau, through a bypassing of Parliament, has made the decision to ban guns across this country. I am concerned that it is handguns at the same time as assault rifles, at the same time as 10 and 12 gauge shotguns. Justin Trudeau, do you remember that Justin Trudeau in 2010 told us that he totally understands that people might need to go out into the wilderness and shoot something?
Guns is just the first step towards taking away guns from everyone. That's never going to happen because here in Canada, we have a culture that has grown up with guns and respects the need to go out into the wilderness and shoot things from time to time.
I remember that when you were trying to get along with us and be one of us Canadian type people. It's two-faced. It's two-faced because you don't believe in what you're saying, because you're a teleprompter reader. Justin Trudeau's a teleprompter reader, a professional teleprompter reader. Most of these people in the news are professional teleprompting readers. They don't care about how you feel. They're not passionate about what they're saying. They don't believe it in their heart. They don't care about whether or not you're going to be successful or we come back to normal. They care about the clicks. They don't care about you. And it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous that any of us would assume that they do. Both the Canadian press and the Toronto Police were contacted about these matters before this column ran. In an email, an editor at the Canadian Press said they were looking into the matter but had no further comment at the time. An officer with the communications department of the Toronto Police said that that my request to speak with Detective D. Danelli would be passed along. But as of 24 hours later, there has been no reply beyond confirming receipt of my messages. This is unfortunate. Without comment, I can't begin to explain how the public narrative that was established was so wildly off what the statistics actually show. I choose not to speculate, but an explanation would certainly come in handy. If any arrives, I will update you. In the meantime, the debate will continue, of course. There's no doubt about that, but it has to be an informed debate. As I've said before, I have a grim feeling, I'll say it again, but gun control is an important public policy issue, and Canadians were woefully ignorant of it in large part because these issues are not effectively reported on, which we talk about here. The CP's article's central claim that has been at the center of our gun control debate this summer, that has been cited as a secondary source, I don't even know how many times, but the article's central claim of a surge in domestic gun crimes is bad, inaccurate, wrong. And that bad, inaccurate, and wrong information is now at the core of an important and contentious public policy debate. Politicians, including the Prime Minister and Toronto Mayor John Tory, who once strongly opposed a ban on handguns, are now either considering or actively calling for one. This would be a major change to the criminal code involving potentially billions of dollars in private property. It is not an exaggeration to say the CP report is a key part of this debate. Do our political leaders know they're reacting to a story with bad information? Perhaps the more depressing question is whether they'd care if they did. So why are we concerned with the WHO, the World Health Organization? Does anyone remember H1N1 and kind of how that went? Because I think it's worth just going through an article really quick to discuss this and jog some memories. World Health Organization exposed. Former World Health Organization director revealed organization wasn't scared of swine flu. Wait a second, what? A former World Health Organization director revealed how the public health body had no personal fears about swine flu outbreak despite issuing a pandemic level 6, the highest possible global emergency. Do you guys remember how when this all first started, they didn't want to use the term pandemic? They didn't want to use that word. Why? The reason why is because of this. We're going to dig into this real quick. The 2009 swine flu N1H1 pandemic was at the time deemed as a serious threat to the global community. Having started in Mexico City, N1H1 quickly spread around the world and lasted some 20 months. Prediction models from teams of epidemiologists from around the world suggested utter devastation. Pieces of analysis from the now resigned Professor Neil Ferguson at the time suggested about 1/3 of the world's population would become affected, with 65,000 deaths in the UK alone. Such predictions forced the World Health Organization to ramp up their efforts of protecting the public and subsequent issue of a level 6 pandemic. So, Dr. Wolfgang, a German doctor and former member of parliament, had been watching the spread of swine flu in Mexico City, where the virus was first recorded, and was puzzled at the reaction of the World Health Organization. In 2010, he said, "What we experienced in Mexico City was a very mild flu, which did not kill more than usual, which killed even fewer people than usual. This was suddenly a fast-spreading mild flu, a pandemic. But this is not the definition of a pandemic I learned, which has to be severe with a much higher than usual death rate." Dr. Wardag eventually launched an inquiry into the swine flu pandemic and World Health Organization's dealing with the pharmaceutical industry in its lead up to the N1H1 pandemic. This is sounding very similar. Keep all of this in mind as we're watching the whole COVID-19 play out, because this is sounding very similar up to right here. At the council meeting, Dr. Wardag declared that all business deals that had been prepared between individual countries and the pharmaceutical companies were about to be triggered by the WHO. He added, "The relevant contracts were mostly confidential and the companies insist that they should never be published." So wait a second. So the World Health Organization vastly over-panicked the planet. And there are deals that you're not allowed to know about between the World Health Organization, the countries that responded, and the pharmaceutical companies that made billions of dollars when this all came out. As well as speaking to Dr. Wardag, Ms. Frank interviewed German Velasquez, a former World Health Organization director in the Public Health Department who served during the swine flu pandemic. He controversially suggested that those working at the World Health Organization at the time had no fears over N1H1. He explained, "Nobody there was afraid. I didn't know anyone at the WHO who had himself vaccinated. I didn't know anyone at the WHO who had himself vaccinated." Including the Director General, who told journalists in response to their questions that she hadn't had the time but would get herself vaccinated later. Ms. Frank also discovered that the World Health Organization changed its criteria for a level 6 pandemic, deleting severity of illness from the requirement of a pandemic phase. They deleted severity of illness as one of the stipulations for a level 6 pandemic. This made it easier to declare a level 6 pandemic. When Ms. Frank asked Mr. Velasquez about the definition change, he said it was publicized around the world that the criteria for declaring a pandemic were changed, and at the same time the old guidelines vanished from the World Health Organization website. Ms. Frank asked, could they have declared the pandemic level 6 with the old definition? Mr. Velasquez, no, because the severity, the number of deaths would have been a factor. Since that was no longer one of the criteria, it made it easier to declare a pandemic. Is that still not one of the criteria? And is it currently still easier to declare a pandemic? And does it concern you that what these guys are saying is that when this happened the last time, what their belief is that it was an overinflated flu? And that the main issue we had was panic because of government officials and overbearing body, like regulatory bodies, coming in and telling us information that turns out not to be accurate, that we don't learn until after it's already finished and we've spent the money. That's important. So then where do we take further concern with the World Health Organization? Because China exposed data is false and coronavirus started in a lab, says expert. Now this is not just, there are multiple experts now. The Department of Justice happened to be one of those experts. We have Justin Trudeau, who finally had to come out. Now, we're going to get into something else here because I think there's a really weird relationship going on between Justin Trudeau and China. Like, I'm not totally sure what's going on there. I think it's really odd that just before the pandemic really ramped up, we sent our PPE to China and then had to purchase it back from them. One sec. Canada sends 16 tons of PPE. Oh, look. Canada sends 16 tons of PPE to China. Canada has sent 16 tons of personal protective equipment such as clothing, face shields, masks, goggles, and gloves to China since February the 4th. Since February the 4th. Why is February the 4th important? Because the coronavirus was already doing its thing. And I'm fairly confident that there was opposition in Canada to us sending our PPE during a global pandemic out of our country to China. I'm pretty sure that we had people in Canada saying, Justin, what are you doing? Yeah, Canada gave away medical equipment to China before facing shortages. Critics of Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau response to the Wuhan virus charge that one reason Canada finds itself short of vital medical supplies may be that Trudeau shipped a great deal of it to China in the last days before the Communist Party's secrecy and duplicity unleashed the pandemic upon the world. Why is that important? Because I'm pretty sure we had to buy it back. Canada buys PPE back from China. Oh, look. And then we had to purchase our own PPE back at cost. Depleted national stockpile leaves Canada reliant on China for masks, gowns, and other supplies during pandemic. So we sent our PPE to China after the global pandemic had started, and then we had to purchase it back from China after the global pandemic had started, and China sends contaminated PPE to Canada. Substandard Chinese N95 masks being considered for non-medical use. Public Health Agency of Canada currently testing more than 5 million N95 masks for use in Canada. 1 million Chinese-made N95 respirator masks that did not meet Canadian quality control standards are being examined by public health officials to see if they can be used in non-medical settings. Oh, at least we're going to try to save the money that we spent, right? The official, speaking on background, said the masks were delivered the week of April the 6th, and testing showed they didn't meet the standard that would allow them to completely filter out virus particles. So they're sending us bad masks. So we sent 16 tons of PPE to China after the coronavirus had started, after Justin Trudeau was told not to send our PPE out of the country. Justin Trudeau told not to send PPE to China. Like, I don't know what's going on here. Now that Canada, let's take a look. Now that Canada is rationing masks, Trudeau faces backlash for donating medical supplies to China. What's going on? Canada's official opposition Conservative leader Andrew Scheer took aim at Prime Minister Justin Trudeau for shipping 16 tons of medical supplies to China in February, calling the move outrageous, with current concerns that Canada is running short on supplies amid its own fight against coronavirus. Doctors across the country are facing urgent shortages of critical supplies. PM must explain why did he send 50,118 face shields, 1,101 masks, 1,820 goggles, 36,425 medical overalls, and 200,000 sets of nitrile gloves, 3,000 aprons from Canada's government's own reserves. This is our emergency supply. This is the supply that we have for this. It's the emergency supply in case something happens. We sent it overseas, Scheer tweeted. Andrew, what an embarrassing goober Andrew Scheer is, but that's not the point. Canadian Foreign Affairs Department announced on February the 9th that Canada has deployed approximately 16 tons of personal protective equipment such as clothing, face shields, masks, goggles, and gloves overseas to China, the epicenter of the coronavirus pandemic. The move came after the World Health Organization warned the international community that further international exportation of cases may appear in any country, and that severe coronavirus-related disruptions would occur as a result. It was absolutely certain in early February that we would need this equipment. Amir Adaran, a professor at the University of Ottawa School of Epidemiology and Public Health and its Faculty of Law, told the Globe and Mail. It was absolutely certain in early February that we would need this equipment. We knew. Justin Trudeau knew. We had people tell him, Justin, don't mail our emergency reserve supply of medical equipment out of the country during a global pandemic because that could have negative health impacts on our country. Doesn't matter. So this decision went beyond altruism into high negligence and incompetence because Canada did not and does not have surplus equipment to spare. We knew this. We knew we didn't have the supplies. We knew that we didn't have what was required to deal with this. We knew we were going to have shortages. We knew we were going to have supply issues. The world knew it was going to have supply issues. The World Health Organization told the world it was going to have supply issues. So everyone was fully aware of what was going to happen and where this was going to go and the fact that it was going to get worse. And where did our PPE go? It went to China so that we could get incompetent PPE back, so that we could get PPE back that cannot be used in a medical setting because it does not meet the standard required to be used in Canada. Okay, so local European news outlets reported this week that the majority of rapid coronavirus test kits supplied by China to Spain and the Czech Republic are faulty. So we are relying on China to supply. So China is the epicenter of the coronavirus pandemic that's currently, overwhelming the world. And Justin Trudeau, you're finally in a spot where you're also going to have to ask questions to China because bat soup was a lie. Because bat soup was a lie. Because Canadians were involved. Anyone who's not aware, just one sec, that Canada is involved with what's going on here. Canadian lab involved in Wuhan virus. We're involved, guys. Let's talk about it. And it's really, really frustrating to know that you're being lied to. So, like, for example, online claims that Chinese scientists stole coronavirus from Winnipeg lab have no factual basis. We are on CBC, okay? So they have debunked this as fake news. CBC News report was distorted to create conspiracy theories circulating online. The Public Health Agency of Canada is denying any connection between the National Microbiology Lab in Winnipeg and the 2 scientists who were escorted out of the building last summer and the coronavirus outbreak in China. Baseless stories claiming that the 2 scientists are Chinese spies and that they smuggled the coronavirus to China's only level 4 lab in Wuhan last year have been spreading on all major social media platforms and on conspiracy theorist blogs. One article from a conspiracy blog was shared more than 6,000 times on Facebook on Monday. The story even made its way to Chinese-owned social media app TikTok, where a video publishing these claims was watched more than 350,000 times. This is misinformation and there's no factual basis for claims being made on social media. Eric Morissette, Chief of Media Relations for Health Canada and the Public Agency of Canada, said in response to queries by CBC News. The conspiracy theories seem to be based on a distorted reading of reporting from CBC News published last summer. One of the first mentions occurred Saturday on Twitter, where businessman Kyle Bass claimed that a husband and wife Chinese spy team were recently removed from a level 4 infectious disease facility in Canada for sending pathogens to the Wuhan facility. In the tweet, which was shared more than 12,000 times, he linked the story to CBC News broke in July, revealing that the researcher, her husband, and some of their graduate students were escorted out of the National Microbiology Lab in Winnipeg amid an RCMP investigation into what's being described as a possible policy breach and administrative matter. The RCMP and Health Canada have both stressed that there is no danger to public safety. None. There's no danger. CBC reporting never claimed the 2 scientists were spies or that they brought any version of the coronavirus to the lab in Wuhan. Experts say the disinformation is creating social panic.
Dr. Zhang Chu has been recognized by the Governor General's Innovation Awards.
This work can't be done without teamwork.
She and the team at the National Microbiology Lab have been praised for developing an Ebola vaccine. But just over a week ago, Chu, her husband, and her students from China were evicted from Canada's only level 4 lab, their security access revoked. Staff at the lab was told last Monday the couple is on leave and not to communicate with them.
We're getting this from sources who work at the lab, but who don't want to be identified for fears they'll be punished. They say this is coming just months after IT specialists entered Chu's office after hours and replaced her computer, and her superiors stopped authorizing work trips to China.
Manitoba RCMP confirmed it was called in by the Public Health Agency of Canada on May 24th. A spokesperson says the agency is investigating a policy breach, calling it an administrative matter, and it's taking steps to resolve it expeditiously. We can assure Canadians that there is no risk to the public and that the work of the NML continues in support of the health and safety of all Canadians.
All this, of course, is unproven, but even microbiology, sometimes especially microbiology, can have issues that involve national security.
It's something CSIS has already warned about.
Canada is facing threats from foreign espionage, and not just in the traditional sense of trying to understand what our national security interests are and agencies are involved with, but threats to our economic security.
She worked with Gary Kobanger, who is now a professor in the Department of Microbiology and Infectious Disease and director of the Research Center of Infectious Disease at Laval University in Quebec, affiliated with the Chinese university. So we're not supposed to be at all concerned about what's going on, about the fact that there was a level 4 lab in Winnipeg, that it's the only lab in Canada that's allowed to deal with these kinds of viruses, and we had people from China working in those labs that were all basically full stop. All of your access is shut down. Your trips to China are shut down. These people were arrested by the RCMP, who won't further comment on what's going on, but trust us, because this isn't related to the level 4 lab that happens to be in Wuhan, China, that also is the only place in China, side note, that's allowed to deal with the same things. There's no correlation between these things, though. See, the problem is that we don't know. The problem is the lack of information. The problem I have right now is that there's too much information for me not to ask questions. And no one wants to provide any information to make us feel any better about what's going on. So all we can do is sit here and make assumptions on what could possibly be happening. This is a real big story. Like these two Chinese microbiologists being arrested out of a level 4 lab in Canada, that there's rumors that there's ties to Wuhan, China, and then Wuhan, China, their level 4 lab happens to have some kind of a breakout. It's originally bat soup, and now it's a breakout from the level 4 lab, and now the world is dealing with a global pandemic, and these people just happen to be arrested a little while before that do you see why I have concerns? Wait, let's take it a step further. Who's Charles Lieber, and why did he get arrested? Professor Charles Lieber was arrested in January 2020 for misleading federal authorities about funds he allegedly received from Wuhan University of Technology and his connections to a Chinese government-sponsored recruitment program. So what's going on here? Oh, look here, flashback. U.S. Customs caught a Chinese biologist with SARS in his bag at the airport. Let's find the exact quote, because this is from 2018. Custom and Border Protection agents stopped a Chinese biologist at the airport in Detroit as he entered the United States. They were suspicious about items in his luggage, which contained a number of vials that were improperly labeled. Quote, inspection of the writing on the vials and the stated recipient led inspection personnel to believe the materials contained within the vials may be viable Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, MERS, and severe acute respiratory syndrome, SARS, material, says an unclassified FBI tactical intelligence report obtained by Yahoo News. The report, which by the Chemical and Biological Intelligence Unit of the FBI's Weapons of Mass Destruction Directorate, does not give the name of the Chinese scientist carrying the suspected SARS and MERS samples or the intended recipient in the United States, but the FBI concluded that the incident and 2 other cases cited in the report were part of an alarming pattern. On a similar note, in January 2020, more than a month into Wuhan coronavirus spreading around the world, Harvard's leading chemistry professor was arrested along with 2 Chinese nationals for aiding the Communist Party of China. Here are some details from the Department of Justice. Dr. Charles Lieber, 60, chair of the Department of Chemistry and Chemical Biology at Harvard University, was arrested this morning and charged by criminal complaint with 1 count of making a materially false, fictitious, and fraudulent statement Yan King Yi, 29, a Chinese national, was charged in an indictment today with 1 count of visa fraud, making false statements, acting as an agent of a foreign government, and conspiracy. Yi is currently in China. Zhaozong Zheng, 30, a Chinese national, was arrested on December the 10th, 2019 at Boston Logan's International Airport and charged by criminal complaint with attempting to smuggle 21 vials of biological research to China. On January the 21st, 2020, Zhang was indicted on 1 count of smuggling goods from the United States and 1 count of making false, fictitious, or fraudulent statements. He has been detained since December the 30th, 2019. But even more importantly and relevant, the work Lieber did at Harvard is connected to Wuhan. According to court documents since 2008, Dr. Lieber, who has served as the principal investigator of the Lieber Research Group at Harvard University, which specialized in the area of nanoscience, has received more than $15 million in grant funding from the National Institute of Health and Department of Defense. These grants require the disclosure of significant foreign financial conflicts of interest, including financial reports from foreign governments or foreign entities, the DOJ reveals. Unbeknownst to Harvard University beginning in 2011, Lieber became a strategic scientist at Wuhan University of Technology in China and was a contractual participant in China's 1,000 Talents plan from in or about 2012 to 2017. China's 1,000 Talents plan is one of the most prominent Chinese talent recruitment plans that are designed to attract, recruit, and cultivate high-level scientific talent to furtherance of China's scientific development, economic prosperity, and national security. As we continue to investigate what happened in Wuhan coronavirus and further expose the Chinese Communist Party for lying about it for months, details about China's malicious intent will become increasingly clear. Did Wuhan coronavirus plaguing the world and causing massive economic destruction come from a lab? A Chinese paper published in December, which has been censored and taken down, indicates the answer is yes.
Last night, we showed you the video, and it was nauseating, of Senior World Health Organization official Bruce Aylward, a Canadian, refusing to answer questions about Taiwan and how it was dealing with coronavirus. In fact, Aylward wouldn't even acknowledge the question or acknowledge the existence of Taiwan. It was repulsive, but it wasn't surprising. Aylward was just following directions from the very top. Tedros Adhanom, he's the Director General of the World Health Organization, got his job with Chinese support after he covered up cholera outbreaks in his home country, a perfect man to lead the World Health Organization. And he has subsequently set the standard for corruption there. Here he is in January. Watch this.
The Chinese government is to be congratulated for the extraordinary measures it has taken to contain the outbreak. The speed with which China detected the outbreak, isolated the virus, sequenced the genome, and shared it with WHO and the world are very impressive and beyond words. China is actually setting a new standard for outbreak response, and it's not an exaggeration.
That's the top public health official in the world, and everything you just heard him say there was a lie.
Correct.
A recent 60 Minutes piece from Australia, a piece our media are not playing, shows just how deep the lies go. In fact, there was nothing speedy about how China detected the outbreak and then warned the world. Indeed, they did the exact opposite.
From the very beginning, throughout December, it was spreading, and we now know it was spreading human to human. But the official line of the Chinese government was that this was all related to an animal market, and once they closed the market, it would all go away.
Did they know differently at that time?
Yes.
Absolutely. Because they were seeing cases coming into the hospitals that had nothing whatsoever to do with the animal market.
So the World Health Organization's leadership tells you that China, quote, set the standard for the outbreak to the response. Apparently that standard includes disappearing doctors who tell the truth about it.
As China now tries to rewrite history and claim it was transparent all along, a final nail in the coffin of their lie, Just 2 weeks ago, the head of emergency at Wuhan Central Hospital, Dr. Ai Fen, also went public, saying authorities had stopped her and her colleagues from warning the world. She has now disappeared, whereabouts unknown.
No one knows.
Again, why is it left to Australian media to produce a piece like this?
Yeah.
The truth is, as 60 Minutes Australia explains, instead of worrying about these developments, in early February, the director of the World Health Organization was still lecturing the public that using terms like Wuhan virus was racist.
Having a name matters to prevent the use of other names that can be inaccurate or stigmatizing.
You might think that a World Health Organization, a group that got 58 million of your tax dollars last year, might care that a government arrests doctors and lies about deadly new diseases, but no. Like so many other organizations, they are lapdogs for the powerful, and that means their real job is sucking up to the Chinese government. And speaking of the Chinese government, on February 6, scientists from the South China University of Technology uploaded a paper on the origins of coronavirus. Where did it come from? Well, this offers some clue. At the time, the official death toll in China from the coronavirus was 564. The paper made a number of notable observations and claims that are worth knowing about, and that's why we're telling you. We want to be clear that we're not endorsing any of these conclusions. We haven't independently confirmed them. We can't. But you should keep in mind as you hear this that these findings come from Chinese scientists who work for a university that is controlled by the Chinese government. So whatever else they are, the views you're about to hear are probably not racist anti-Chinese propaganda.
Right.
Here's what the paper says. First, the scientists confirm what scientists around the world have said they believe. The virus most likely came from an animal known as the intermediate horseshoe bat. Here's the striking thing. There are no known colonies of this bat within 900 kilometers of Wuhan.
Thank you.
Nor is there any evidence that they were sold in the Wuhan wet market, despite many claims in the American media to the contrary, including on this show, by the way. Last night we did a segment on wet markets, the one in Wuhan included, and suggested that this bat was sold there. But let's be clear. The only actual analysis of that question that we're aware of is in this paper. Right. These scientists interviewed almost 60 people, 59 of them, who frequented the Wuhan wet market. They confirmed there were no horseshoe bats for sale there, period. So that raises the question, where did the virus-carrying bats come from? And the paper says this, quote, "We screened the area around the market and identified 2 laboratories conducting research on bat coronavirus. Within a few hundred yards of the wet market was something called the Wuhan Center for Disease Control and Prevention. According to public reports, the center used intermediate horseshoe bats for research. Then about 7 miles away was another facility. This one was called the Wuhan Institute of Virology. The Virology Institute also conducted research on intermediate horseshoe bats, the ones that were not sold at the wet market. South China University scientists concluded that the coronavirus pandemic, the one that people are dying from here, likely came from one of these 2 government labs in Wuhan. They noticed that a scientist at the Wuhan Center for Disease Control and Prevention had been exposed to the blood and urine of horseshoe bats. They also suggested that infected tissue samples from research animals may have wound up in the Wuhan wet market. And they ended the paper this way, quote, "The killer coronavirus probably originated from a laboratory in Wuhan. Safety levels may need to be reinforced in high-risk biohazardous laboratories. Regulations may be taken to relocate these laboratories far away from city centers and other densely populated places." End quote. How's that for interesting? Now, this paper has been online for nearly 2 months, and so far it has been virtually ignored in this country. Almost nobody in American journalism has dared to write about it. The few who have were immediately attacked as dangerous conspiracy theorists. Instead of assessing what seemed like the rational conclusions presented in the Chinese paper, there was a spate of American news stories and academic research designed to show that the coronavirus absolutely could not have been engineered in a Chinese lab. They sounded supremely confident of that. But do they really know it? And the answer is no, they don't. As a factual matter, it is impossible for Western scientists to settle the question either way. So instead of doing that or admitting that, they amped up the rhetoric, hoping that you wouldn't notice the difference. A post on the National Institutes of Health website, written by NIH Director Francis Collins himself, dismisses any such speculation as, quote, outrageous. Keep in mind, NIH is supposed to be keeping you safe from diseases like this one. not running political interference for hostile foreign governments. This is how they're spending their time as Americans die in the middle of a global pandemic. And still, no one addressed the substance of the claims. The South China University paper concludes that the virus probably escaped accidentally from a lab in Wuhan. It said not one word about bioweapons. Yet the NIH and USA Today and countless other outlets have devoted thousands of words to scolding you for thinking the virus may have been a form of biological warfare. Notice that's a totally different claim than the one made in the paper. And that's not accidental. One of the surest signs that people are lying to you is when they answer questions you didn't ask. Yes. And that's exactly what the professional class is doing with this story. And they're doing it on many fronts. They're lying to you. They're claiming to know things they don't know. They're dismissing the obvious as impossible. They're blaming you for their failures. And the media are helping them do it. The stakes are too high to let them continue this way. So no matter what, stay skeptical as you assess the world. Remain rational. Gather your own evidence and come to your own conclusions. You shouldn't have to do that. You ought to be able to trust the people in charge. But you can't. So at this point, you have no choice.
So where I'm at right now is with all of this going on, I have questions. I have all kinds of questions that I wish somebody in government would be able to answer. I'd like to know what's going on with the World Health Organization. I'd like to know further why Justin Trudeau finally has to talk about it. I'd like to know if there is some kind of corruption going on within that organization or the CDC and their reporting of the coronavirus. I'd like to know if the previous reporting from the CDC, which was deemed inaccurate, the previous pandemic reporting that caused billions of dollars to be made inappropriately because it was an overreaction and should not have happened the way that it did. I'd like to know if anyone wants to talk about that. I'd like to know if we have a conclusion from China on what's going on. I'd like to know why it is that we're currently being best friends with China and getting medical supplies from China and then finding out that it's contaminated, but we don't want to talk about that because what's happening? What's going on right now, guys? So why am I concerned? Why am I concerned? I'm concerned because we are working directly with China, like Canada is working directly with China to try to come up with the vaccine, and our medical equipment comes from China, and the information that we're getting comes from the World Health Organization, who are now best friends, and it's confirmed best friends with China. And the reason why I'm bothered by that is because I feel like we're up here in Canada and we're behind. We're behind on what other people already know about what's going on in the world. So like holding China accountable is in Canada's moral and strategic interest, says ex-ambassador. What's she saying? Investigating China and holding its authoritarian regime accountable for the actions early on in the COVID-19 pandemic is in Canada's moral and strategic interests. Former U.S. President Barack Obama's top diplomat to the United Nations told CBC News. The whole world has an interest in getting to the bottom of what's happened, said Samantha Power in an interview Wednesday with CBC News Network's Power and Politics. It's not just in Canada's moral interest and in keeping with Canada's finest traditions, but also in its strategic interests. If China feels great impunity at a time like this, having locked up scientists and those who are warning of this pandemic, having not been transparent with the outside world with such life and death consequences, imagine how President Xi and his Chinese regime will take that to the bank. Multiple media reports suggest China took steps to silence whistleblowers and conceal the truth and extent of the novel coronavirus outbreak. One report says China waited 6 days to warn the public of a likely pandemic. Power said China's actions absolutely should be investigated. This has been different versions of a cover-up from start to finish, and yet it warrants investigation so that China can learn from this, given its role in the origins and the spread of the crisis. And plot twist, because this is probably the most important part of the episode, because if you remember 2 months ago you were racist if you had even suggested that it had anything to do with China. And Trudeau says world has questions, particularly for China, on COVID-19 origin. So other people did 2 months ago. Canada, this is why I say I feel like we're behind. 2 days ago, Justin Trudeau has finally decided that his best friends in China might need to answer some questions. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says there will be questions, particularly for China, about how the coronavirus pandemic began and its handling of the early days of the crisis. His comments to journalists during a daily press briefing come on the heels of a new Angus Reid poll that finds the overwhelming majority of Canadians do not believe China has been transparent about its handling of the pandemic and do not want closer ties with the country. Canadians don't want this. That's what's being said. That's what's being said right now. And the thing is, it's more than just this topic. Canadians don't want the gun ban. Canadians don't want the handgun ban. Canadians don't want the 10 and 12 gauges to go. Canadians don't want tighter relationships with China. Canadians don't want our PPE coming from China when they're sending contaminated PPE to us. Canadians are talking to the government right now, and nobody's listening to us. No one's listening to us. And Justin Trudeau is running around telling us what he's going to do when we have Andrew Scheer, who, I'm sorry, Andrew Scheer is just as much of the problem. He's just as much of a problem as Justin Trudeau. He's not holding Justin Trudeau to account. Do you remember the SNC Lavalin where he's sitting there and snickering about how Trudeau should be in trouble? Because I remember that. I remember how he looked like a little kid on the stage. He didn't look like a political leader. He didn't look like the guy who was going to run our country next. He looked like a little kid who had just caught a little brother in a cookie jar. Like, ooh, it was funny. That's embarrassing. It's embarrassing. Like, this is why we're not taken seriously. What is going on right now? One sec. Canadian opinions. Let's just take a quick look. Canadian opinions of China reach new low. May the 13th, 2020. The latest study from a nonprofit Angus Reid Institute finds Canadians' favorability toward China at a new low. Indeed, just 14% of adults in this country now say they have a positive opinion of China, a level half as high as it was 6 months ago. The deterioration comes as Beijing faces accusations from the United States intelligence that it intentionally hid the severity of COVID-19 outbreak in the early days of the pandemic. Others have expressed skepticism regarding the true number of Chinese cases and deaths from the illness. More than 4 in 5, 85% of Canadians say the Chinese government has not been honest about what has happened in its own country. Canadian opinion toward China has significantly declined since the government arrested and detained 2 Canadians in prison in a tit-for-tat reaction to Canada's arrest and subsequent release on bail of Huawei executive Ming Wanzhou. If Canadians had their way, there would be a real-world consequence to perceived malfeasance on the part of the Asian power. Just 11% of Canadians say Canada should focus its trade efforts on China, down from 40% in 2015. 40% to 15, sorry, 11. 11% of Canadians are now supporting this. Further, 4 in 5 say Canada should bar Huawei from taking part in the building of the new 5G infrastructure in the country. Why is China in our telecommunications? Particularly if 4 in 5 Canadians do not support China being part of our telecommunications infrastructure. Why? More key findings. Asked about the country's approach to relations with China, 3/4 of Canadians, 76%, say Canada should prioritize human rights. They should prioritize human rights and the rule of law over economic opportunity. Human rights and the rule of law over economic opportunity with China. The United States' favorability among Canadians has now dropped to 38%, plummeting to a 40-year record low. Among a list of Canadian major trading partners, the European Union emerges as a top choice, 52%, to develop closer trade ties, though notably support for an increasing trade with the United States has also risen by 9 points since 2019, now at 37%. We're just being ignored. Canadians are just being ignored. Canadians are telling you, Canadians are trying to express this, but politicians don't get the message. The level of separation between me as a voice and how I feel and my tax-paying dollars being spent and the politicians that make the final decision. Like, the only country that we are less favorable toward is Saudi Arabia. Regionally, British Columbians, so the highest Chinese population in all of Canada lives in BC, and 22% of BC have a favorable rating of China right now. I'm not saying whether that's right or wrong, actually, but what I am saying is that the government should be responding to that. So I'm not trying to argue about whether or not Canadians should or shouldn't feel a particular way, because that's not my business. That's up to Canadians to develop and determine how they feel about things. But I am saying I think it's ridiculous that this is how Canadians feel. It's obvious that this is not new. This is how Canadians have felt. And it's only 2 days ago that any of this is coming up. We're months in. We are months in on coronavirus, on the quarantine, on shutting down the jobs, on the economy being wiped out. And now we're discussing any of this. What's going on? What's going on in Canada? What's going on in the Western world? What's going on around the world in general? What's going on with the World Health Organization? What's going on with the CDC? What's going on with Bill Gates and Fauci? Why is Fauci making hundreds of billions of dollars? There's a lot of things happening that we have questions about, and somebody in government needs to start answering those questions. Guys, thank you so much for watching the DFNN, the Dumpster Fire News Network. I'm your host, Alexander. I appreciate the fact that people are coming on here and checking out this content. We're going to continue to try to post as much as we can to try to get as much of this news out to you guys as we can. Hopefully you guys have a fantastic weekend. Hopefully this episode was informative, and we will see you guys next week.